In 1984, the world watched Yugoslavia light this Olympic torch. 8 years later, that same stadium was a mass grave. How does a country that hosts the Winter Olympics cease to exist a decade later? In 1980, one man died, and world leaders flew in to bury him, more than who showed up for Churchill, more than who came for Kennedy even. That should have been a warning, because the only thing holding Yugoslavia together was him, and the moment he was gone, the clock started ticking. This is the story of how one man's dream became history's most complicated breakup. To understand the collapse, you have to understand what Tito actually built, because Yugoslavia wasn't a country that fell apart. It was a country that was never really one country to begin with. Let's start with 1918 and the end of World War I. The Austro-Hungarian Empire had just collapsed. The map of Central Europe was a mess of ethnic groups, languages, and competing claims, and the diplomats at Versailles had to do something with all of it. But the chain of events that made Yugoslavia possible started right here, in Sarajevo. In 1914, a Bosnian Serb assassinated Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, on a bridge in the city center. The war that followed destroyed the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and in doing so, it created the political space for a South Slavic state to exist for the first time. Their solution at Versailles was to bundle together the Kingdom of Serbia, the Kingdom of Montenegro, and the former Austro-Hungarian territories of Slovenia, Croatia, and Bosnia into one new country. They called it the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes. Note that even the name was a compromise that satisfied no one. The Macedonians weren't even in it, neither were the Bosnians, and the three groups that were named in it immediately started arguing about who was really in charge. This is kind of one of the important parts about Yugoslavia that makes everything else make sense. The borders weren't drawn around ethnic groups. The ethnic groups were drawn around the borders. Serbs, Croats, Bosnians, Slovenes, they were all living together. The kingdom lurched through the 1920s with constant political instability. In 1934, King Alexander, who had renamed the country Yugoslavia, meaning the land of the South Slavs, was assassinated in Marseille, shot dead on a newsreel camera, one of the first political assassinations ever caught on film. Then in 1941, Nazi Germany invaded, and the whole thing collapsed almost immediately. The Axis powers carved Yugoslavia up between themselves and installed puppet governments. In Croatia, they handed control to a group called the Ustasa, an ultra-nationalist movement allied with Nazi Germany. What followed was one of the darkest chapters of the entire war in Europe. Ustasa carried out the systematic genocide of Serbs, Jews, and Roma. Hundreds of thousands of people were killed. It's worth being clear about something. The Ustasa never had the support of more than a small fraction of the Croatian population, and many Serbs rejected their rival nationalist Chetniks and joined the partisans instead. The partisans became the largest communist-led resistance movement in occupied Europe, and they did it largely without outside help. But the civil war within the occupation left wounds that wouldn't heal for generations. This matters not as ancient history, but because 50 years later, when Croatia declared independence and raises a flag, it had markings that looked like their wartime one. The Serbs living in Croatia aren't being paranoid. They remember their flag, and so do their grandparents. That memory is going to shape everything that comes later. In 1945, after the Allied victory, Yugoslavia was rebuilt, this time as a socialist federation of 6 republics, and at the head of it was one man. Tito inherited a country that had already tried to tear itself apart before, and had the mass graves to prove it. His answer wasn't to fix the divisions, it was to build something on top of them. What Tito built was really remarkable. Most of Eastern Europe in 1945 became Soviet satellite states, countries that existed on paper but took their orders from Moscow. Tito refused. He broke with Stalin in 1948, just 3 years after the war ended. Stalin was furious. He sent threatening letters. He demanded loyalty. Tito reportedly sent one back. "Stop sending people to kill me. If you don't stop, I'll send one man to Moscow, and I won't need to send a second." The point being that Stalin sent at least 2 assassination teams into Yugoslavia. Neither succeeded. But by refusing to pick a side, Tito made Yugoslavia something generally unique in the Cold War era. A communist country that traded with the West, that its citizens could get visas to travel from. A Yugoslav passport was one of the most valuable travel documents in Eastern Europe at the time. People generally envied it. But the most important project was internal. Tito understood that Yugoslavia's biggest threat wasn't the Soviet Union, it was the ethnic tensions sitting inside the country. His answer was a concept called Brotherhood and Unity. He structured Yugoslavia so that no single group could dominate. 6 republics, 2 provinces within Serbia, specifically designed to dilute Serbian political power, a rotating collective presidency, and an army with deliberately mixed officer corps. The school curriculum taught Yugoslav identity first, ethnic identity second, and for one generation it worked. There are people alive today who will tell you without hesitation that they were Yugoslav first, not Serb, Croat, or Bosnian. That identity was real. The 1984 Sarajevo Winter Olympics was the peak of it all. Yugoslavia showing the world that it had worked, that a country built from contradictions could put on one of the finest Winter Olympics in history. Sadly, 4 years before those games, Tito had died. Tito's system was an extraordinary piece of political engineering. The problem was it required Tito to run it. Without him, the rotating presidency he designed as a safeguard became a source of paralysis. No one was clearly in charge, and in that vacuum, something was waiting. So here's the part about Yugoslavia that some videos skip over. And it matters. Throughout the 1970s, the economy was actually doing pretty well by Eastern European standards. The country had borrowed heavily from Western banks to fund infrastructure and industry, but as long as the economy kept growing, it was manageable. Then the 1980s hit all at once. Tito died, global interest rates spiked, Yugoslavia's $20 billion foreign debt became almost impossible to service. The IMF stepped in with an austerity program. Wages were frozen, but prices weren't. By 1989, inflation had hit 2,500%. The middle class that Tito had spent decades building was hollowed out, not by a war or an ethnic group, but by economics. Across Eastern Europe, communist governments were falling. One-party systems were giving way to elections almost everywhere. The ideology that held Yugoslavia together was losing its footing across the entire continent. Another factor worth mentioning here, throughout the entire Cold War, the threat of the Soviet invasion had been one of the things quietly holding Yugoslavia together. When communism started collapsing across Eastern Europe, that threat evaporated almost overnight, and with it, so did American interest in supporting a non-aligned socialist country. Yugoslavia lost 2 of its reasons to stay united almost at the same time. So the thing about economic failure, combined with political uncertainty, people need somewhere to put that anger. And when your life gets worse and the system that promised to fix it is visibly failing, older answers and voices started sounding more convincing. And here's a footnote in the 1980s worth mentioning. While all this was unfolding, Yugoslavia was somehow producing one of the greatest generations of basketball players the world had ever seen. And some of the best football, soccer generations too. Players would go on to win trophies across Europe, and they never got to play together as one nation again. By 1989, that combination of economic collapse, a broken political system, identity politics filling the gap, has never ended well anywhere in history, and it didn't end well here either. In this environment, Slobodan Milosevic rose through the Serbian branch of the ruling Communist Party. Remember Tito's system? 8 voting members across 6 republics and 2 provinces, designed so that no single group could dominate. As Yugoslavia's principal system fractured, Milosevic aligned himself increasingly with Serbian nationalism. His speeches drew large crowds, his influence grew fast. His supporters used large street protests, they called them the rallies of truth, to pressure and replace political leaders, Kosovo, Vojvodina, and Montenegro, with allies of Belgrade. Serbia now effectively controlled 4 of the 8 votes. In 1989, the autonomy of Kosovo was abolished. Kosovo was around 80% ethnic Albanian. More than 1,000 Albanian miners went on hunger strike underground in protest. The situation in Kosovo would simmer for another decade before it boiled over. So some of the context we're stating. In 1989, the polling data here showed that 72% of Serbs living in Croatia described relations in their community as very good, or mainly good. In Bosnia, 90% of people said the same thing about their own neighborhood. But when they asked about the ethnic relations of Yugoslavia as a whole, the numbers collapsed. The propaganda wasn't changing how people felt about their neighbor. It was changing how they imagined everyone else felt. Fear was being manufactured at scale, and it was working. What became the last ever meeting of Yugoslavia's ruling party? Slovenian delegates pushed for more autonomy for the republics. Serbia's side pushed for more centralization. The debate went nowhere. The Slovenians walked out. The Croatians and Macedonians followed. The League of Communists never met again. European negotiators tried to hold Yugoslavia together through a series of proposed agreements, but each plan ran into the same problem. The republics no longer agreed on what the country should be, or whether it should exist at all. None of this was new. The tensions had been there for decades. What changed was the system holding them together in place was gone now. Multiple party elections took place across 6 republics for the first time. In Croatia, voters elected the Croatian Democratic Union under Franjo Tuđman. The new Croatian flag was raised. For many Serbs living in Croatia, this wasn't just a flag change. It was a reminder. Remember what we discussed, the wartime atrocities, the living memory? In Knin, a Serb-majority town, local Serbs began a rebellion. Roads were blocked. Croatian special forces helicopters were sent to deal with it. Yugoslav army jets flew alongside them and ordered them to turn back or be shot down. They ended up turning back. This wasn't a local dispute. The Yugoslav army was now clearly involved, and from that moment, the scale of what was coming became very clear. On June 25th of 1991, Slovenia and Croatia both declared independence. Slovenia was relatively contained. There were very few Serbs in Slovenia. Belgrade didn't have strong reasons to control it. The Yugoslav army went in, and there was 10 days of fighting. Very few casualties compared to what was coming. And then it was over. Slovenia was out. Croatia was a completely different story, and everyone knew it. The war in Croatia was brutal, but by the standards of what came next, it was just the opening act. Serbian forces, backed by the Yugoslav army, pushed deep into Croatian territory. The town of Vukovar became the symbol of it. Croatians' defenders held it for 87 days against tank, artillery, and air power. When Vukovar finally fell in November of 1991, it had been reduced to rubble. The graves came later. In early 1992, Serbian forces held around a third of Croatian territory. A ceasefire was signed in January, but the bloodiest conflict was just beginning. Bosnia and Herzegovina was the most ethnically mixed republic. Bosniaks, Serbs, and Croats living intertwined across every town and city. There was no clean line you could draw through Bosnia that would separate them, which made any war there unlike anything else. In February of 1992, Bosnia held a referendum on independence. Most Bosnians and Croats voted in favor. Most Bosnian Serbs boycotted. The day after the results, violence broke out in Sarajevo. Within weeks, Bosnian Serb forces had taken positions on the hills above the city and begun what became the longest siege of the capital in history of modern warfare. Nearly 4 years, over 10,000 people were killed, the majority of them civilians. And here's something lighter that tells you how complicated the Balkan part of the world really is. Bosnia and Herzegovina, a country of 3.5 million people, has around 26 kilometers of coastline, with one town, Neum. Croatia literally wraps around it on both sides. After the war, Croatia eventually builds an entire bridge just so it could drive between its own territory without crossing Bosnia. It kind of shows that they'd rather build a bridge to avoid each other in the Balkans. It's worth stating clearly that all 3 sides committed atrocities in the Bosnian War. Alliances shifted. Bosniaks and Croats started fighting for a common enemy. Then they turned on each other, and then they eventually came back together. What began as one conflict became several overlapping ones. And also when the war started, ordinary people mostly didn't want it. In Serbia, there were mass protests against Milosevic. Around 200,000 young Serbians fled the country rather than serve. An estimated 50% of all Serbians and 80% of Belgrade residents dodged the military draft. The war was started by elites and fought largely by those who couldn't avoid it. The international community tried to intervene. The Vance-Owen plan proposed dividing Bosnia into 10 ethnic provinces. The Bosnians and Croats leaders agreed to it. The Bosnian Serbs, who controlled about 2/3 of Bosnian territory at that point, refused. Accepting the plan would mean giving up land they had already taken, and the plan collapsed. The UN declared several Bosnian towns safe areas, places where civilians could shelter under international protection. One of them was Srebrenica, in eastern Bosnia, which had become a refuge for Bosniaks who had fled their homes. In July of 1995, Bosnian Serbs forces overran Srebrenica, while it was under UN protection. Around 8,000 Bosnians were killed. Srebrenica was the moment the West's patience ran out. NATO launched a sustained bombing campaign against the Bosnian Serbs' military targets. At the same time, Croatia had spent years quietly rebuilding its military. In 1995, Croatian forces launched 2 large offensives and retook most of the Serbian-held territory within days. The mass majorities of the Croatian Serbs fled. Communities that had lived there forever were gone within weeks. The peace agreement that finally ended the Bosnian War wasn't signed in Geneva or Brussels or even The Hague. It was negotiated on a US Air Force base in Dayton, Ohio. That tells you something about how Europe's ability to manage this had broken down. The Dayton Accords kept Bosnia as one country, but divided it into 2 entities. The arrangement was complex enough to stop fighting. Whether it built anything lasting is a different question. The wars didn't end cleanly in Dayton. Through the 1990s, the Kosovo Liberation Army effectively took control of large parts of Kosovo. Serbian forces responded with a crackdown. NATO intervened again in 1999. In 2008, Kosovo declared independence. Serbia has never recognized it. Neither has Russia, China, or 5 EU member states. The situation remains unresolved to this day. So here's the honest version of where things stand. Bosnia is one of the poorest countries in Europe, and its constitution, written at Dayton to stop the war, ruled illegal by the European courts. It excludes citizens who aren't Bosnia, Serb, or Croats from running for certain public offices, and that still hasn't changed. Kosovo's independence is still contested. The question of the Balkans, who belongs where, and who holds what rights to what territory hasn't been answered. It's just been paused. What's true is that the cities are alive again. Sarajevo is a real city. People are going to work, drinking coffee, and watching football. Normal stuff. The former Yugoslav republics have rebuilt. That part is real and worth saying. The breakup of Yugoslavia is still debated today, and different countries remember it in very different ways. What caused it, who bears responsibility, and what could have been done differently? Those questions don't have clean answers, and they probably never will. What I can say is this: Tito spent 35 years constructing a shared identity out of people who had every reason to distrust each other. And for one generation and one man's lifetime, many people felt it was real. Whether that makes it a tragedy or a lesson depends on where you're standing, and which side of the border you call home. If you're still around, I'd like to thank you for watching. If you've learned or liked something today, I appreciate it if you hit like or subscribe. This has been Mapped Out with Sean. Thanks for watching.